Well, it's a little bit like, not that I'm comparing myself with C.S. Lewis, but it's a little bit like, I got in the sidecar at Oxford, not a Christian, right? I got out of the
Yeah.
side. It's a little bit like that. I came to
It does
church
sound-
that day, not a Christian, and I went home from church that day, a Christian. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that, as Wesley said, there was a strange sort of quickening at the
Yeah.
time of and I just thought to myself, you know what? It's actually true.
Yeah.
The essence of the story, Caleb, is that I was challenged primarily by my wife, who came to faith before I did, and that, as many of the men listening would immediately recognise, can create tensions, as it did in my case. And it became clear to me with various episodes that my wife was determined on this front, and that it wasn't just something that was a passing fad. And
Mhm.
so I recognised that, basically I had to take this seriously. And it was
Mm.
when she said to me that she was going to raise our two sons as Christians, and bluntly, I could do what I liked, right? I thought, no. If I'm faced with my marriage versus, holding out to some, atheist position or whatever it is I was trying to argue at the time, then I knew where my priorities lay. So at that point, I said, yeah, okay, well, I'll agree to go to church, but I'll only agree, pardon me, Caleb, I'll only agree to go to an Anglican church, because I said, and this is maybe a compliment for you down there in Skye, is that I knew that an Anglican church was at least harmless, right? If I'd come to your church, Caleb, I mightn't have had any hope at all, right? But I thought, well, at least an Anglican church is harmless, and so I figured it was no problem going there. As it turned out, of course, God had all of that well and truly under control, and brought me very quickly under the influence of a man who's now still a dear friend of long standing, who was at the time the Anglican minister. He went on to be a bishop of the Anglican Church and was a very distinguished Australian in his own right. He happened to be the vicar, and so very soon after I arrived, he bowled up to have a yarn to me, and it turned out that he wasn't just the vicar, he was also an economist.
Oh, wow.
So God had parked me under the authority of someone who was a professional colleague. And you might think, well, what relevance does that have? Well, the relevance is that I couldn't, pardon me, Caleb, I couldn't immediately dismiss him as somebody who was deluded, right? It's sort of, cottoned onto some superstition, because after all, he was an economist. I mean, give me a break, right? The guy, he's a decent guy. He knows what he's doing, right?
Wow.
And so anyway, he, I think it was the second week in, he came up straight up, as economists do, face to face. And he said to me, you don't believe a word of this, do you? And I said, no, I don't. Right?
Wow.
And he said, yeah, I figured that. He said, well, how long are you going to keep coming here, so long as you don't believe a word of it? And I thought, that's a reasonable question. So I said, well, listen to me. I said, you listen to me, right? I said, economist to economist. Right? I said, if you can explain to me why I should believe it, right? Thinking to myself, you haven't got any chance. But I said, if you can explain to me why I should believe this, then I'll believe it.
Yeah, wow.
And he said, do you mean that? And I said, economist to economist. I said, why would I say that? He said, yeah, I mean, thinking to myself, you got no chance. Right? And he looked at me and he said, you're on.
Oh, I love it. It's great.
I said, oh, yeah? And he said, yeah. He said, have you got a Bible? I said, I can find one. He said, you happy for me to come around to your place on a Tuesday night for a few weeks? I said, oh, yeah. He said,
Wow.
good. He said, then get that Bible. He says, you read it, look in there, you find a book called Mark. He said, you start reading that book. He said, I'll be at your place Tuesday night, so stay for an hour. He said, we'll do a few of these. He said, by the time we've read the book, he said, then we'll have another conversation. And I said, oh, really? Yeah. So anyway, we did. And we started reading this, and he said, now listen, he said, here's the rules of the game, right? He said, you read that. He said, and you can ask me anything you want to ask me. I said, really? You mean that? He said, anything. I said, all right. So I read the book, and as I went through the Gospel of Mark, I had all sorts of questions for him, right? All sorts of, well, really, so this is going to get you, right? So I thought, okay. Anyway, what was most impressive, Caleb, you've been interested in this as a pastor yourself, is that the thing that impressed me most was not that he could explain away or give me answers to various questions. It's when he would say, yeah, good question. Don't know the answer to that. And I would say, you don't know the answer. And he'd say, no, don't know the answer to that. And I'd say, well, hang on, let me get this straight. You don't know the answer to that question, and yet you still believe this to be true. He said, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, how's that supposed to work? And he said, well, he says, I reckon there are lots of things that you don't understand, right? And yet you also believe them to be true. Isn't that right?
Wow.
And I thought, yeah, you got me there, right?
We all do.
You got me there. So anyway, we kept going through this, and when we finished the book of Mark, he said, well, what did you think? And I said, well, I'll give you this much. I said, I don't think it was made up. He says, oh, yeah, why not? I said, well, if it was made up, they wouldn't have, had the Jesus express the exasperation with the disciples and, all these things that are going wrong and this and that. I said, you just wouldn't get it, right? It would have to be a smooth story. And he said, yeah, good. He said, well, then, if that's the case, what do you think about the things that are said, right? He says he's God. Do you actually believe that? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, all right, fair enough. He said, well, you do one more thing. And I said, what's that? He said, I want you to meet me in town. So he went into what was then the Ridley College bookshop. I'm actually on the board of Ridley College these days. Had a bookshop.
I noticed that too.
I met him there. And he said, have you ever been to a bookshop like this before? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, good. He said, come inside. So I went inside and I saw this bookshop in those days, what it was like, a library. It's completely arrayed with books on theology and religious topics and this and that. And I'm an academic, Caleb. I'm a scholar. Right? And I was immediately, my first feeling was to feel completely, what's the right word? Yeah, embarrassed.
Yeah.
I thought, here I am, I call myself a learned person. And I had no idea that there was so much scholarship about the Christian religious traditions. And I thought, oh boy, have you underestimated this? Right? Anyway, so I went in and I said, he said, oh, look, he says, I want to show you a couple of books. And I said, oh, all right. So he went across to the shelf and he pulled off, from the apologetics section, he pulled off a couple of volumes. I can't tell you what they were now. And he opened them up and he said, here, take a look at this, right? Looked at it. And I could see written down there, Caleb, a number of the arguments that I'd been putting to him. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, responses that people have made over the years to these different propositions in this book of Christian apologetics, defense of the faith. And I looked at this and he looked at me and I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, you weren't the first person to think of these things, were you? I said, yeah, all right. I said, how old is this book? He said, about 300 years.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, no. He said, I didn't want to really embarrass you, but just make the point. And I said, yeah, I get it. He said, no. He said, I want to buy you a book. And I said, oh, yeah, what's that? And he said, here. And he bought me a commentary on Mark off the shelf.
Oh, wow.
And he said, look, here's the book, right? He said, now this book goes through that same gospel, and there are scholars here who wrestle with a lot of the questions that you raised, and many that you didn't raise. Right? And I said, oh, what? So the answers are there? He said, no. He said, the answers aren't there. Right? He said, a lot of the questions you asked, no one knows the answer to that. Right? He said, but here's a discussion, a scholarly discussion about, whether it might be this or whether it might be that, and so forth. Right? And here, I'll buy this for you. And wow. I said, well, that's very generous. So he bought it for me and I read the book. And again, it just reinforced the impression that I had completely underestimated this and these sort of cheap one-liners that I was coming up with. Yeah, some of them are, but it was pathetic, Caleb. That's what it was. It was pathetic. They were cheap shots relative to the sort of deep scholarship and discussion and argument and disagreement, which you well know you can find about all of these same things, right? Yeah. And so I realized that the notion that somehow I was being sold a bill of goods and that Christianity was just a sort of fluff and that people were deluded and it was a crutch and all that sort of stuff just completely fell away. I thought, no. Anyway, so about a couple of weeks after that, it was Christmas time, actually, and I went to church on Christmas Day with my wife and two sons, and he was conducting the Christmas Day service, and and he'd preached about prophet, priest, and king, and the three gifts and so forth, as you would recognise. And anyway, came to communion, as we do in the Anglican Church, and there was a call for communion, and people started getting up from their pews to go forward to the rail for communion. And I sat there, Caleb, and I thought to myself, what do you know? It's actually true.
Wow.
So I got up and I went forward to the communion rail. Anyway, he came along and he saw me there, and he gave me communion, right, and went along with the rest. And then straight after the service, he came straight down to where I was sitting, and he said, "You took communion today?" And I said, "Yeah, that's right." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because it's true."
Wow. That was
And he
it.
gave me a great big hug, and I was in the kingdom, brother.
Wow.
It's like,
That's such a fantastic story.
yeah. Well, it's a little bit like, not that I'm comparing myself with C.S. Lewis, but it's a little bit like, I got in the sidecar at Oxford, not a Christian, right? I got out the
Yeah.
side. It's a little bit like that. I came to
It does
church
sound-
that day, not a Christian, and I went home from church that day, a Christian. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that, as Wesley said, there was a strange sort of quickening at the
Yeah.
time of and I just thought to myself, you know what? It's actually true.
Yeah.
So